I love sewing with prints, and one of my favorite skills is how to match up the print across a seam like a center back or a center front seam of a garment. I'm going to show you how ridiculously easy it is to do in this tutorial. It's such a great way to add a professional touch to your handmade clothes. But the method I'll show you doesn't have to be used only for a center back or center front bodice seam. It's just the most common place that I use it. It's also great if you need to add a seam to a pattern, like when you don't have enough room on your fabric to cut a bodice piece on the fold, so you need to add a seam. But now you can match the print perfectly across that seam. There's actually a center front seam here along this thin black line in the print. I had to add one for my narrow vintage fabric to work out. If you need a seam in the middle of your fabric for any reason, I find this is the fastest and easiest way to do it. Plus, this method works whether or not you're inserting a zipper into the seam, like in the center back of a dress, or just sewing the seam shut. So this is how I get nicely matched up prints across the center back zippers of many of my dresses, like this. I'll walk you through this step by step and then give you a quick recap. Get your pattern piece out that you'll be cutting two of. In my case, this is a dress bodice back piece with a center back seam. I'm just using a sample pattern piece, by the way, that I did specifically for this tutorial, so I omitted markings and whatnot to make this more plain. On your pattern piece, identify where the seam is that you're going to be matching the pattern along. Draw your seam line on the pattern piece, showing your seam allowance like I've done here. I also like to draw in the seam allowance for the neckline and the waistline seam or the hem. And it doesn't specifically relate to matching the print along the center back seam, of course, but it is really helpful, I find, when you're placing a print to make sure that you're going to like where it falls everywhere. That's why just for this tutorial, I also drew in this green squiggly line within the seam allowances, just to help remind you what won't show in the finished bodice. So now we're going to cut out our fabric, and this is a little bit hard for me to get high enough up for you to actually see all this, but this will need to be done on a single layer of fabric, whether you lay this out on a big table if you have one or the floor. And I like to just take a few minutes to orient myself to the placement of the print on the fabric, because this is going to be really important, both for you to just be happy that you've placed the print well, but more importantly, so that you know that you have enough fabric and enough room to line up the print along your seam line. So for example, this is just scrap fabric and I'm not making a real dress bodice here, so it doesn't really matter where I place this. But I can see that there's a big tulip here that is repeated up here. So around that might be where I'm going to try and place my pattern piece so that I know that I can have enough room for it to be on one side and on the other side. I've moved this over a bit so you can see better, but this is also why I like to have the seam line for the neckline and the hem or the waistline drawn in as well, because it kind of tells me where is that point going to fall. Obviously it doesn't really matter for a sample, but what does matter is that I know that I can meet up at this point on the fabric and not accidentally find that the place where it's lined up, oops, I have no fabric here. So this is why I spend some time before I start cutting to make sure that I actually have room to place my pattern pieces. And if this part is a little unclear and this is your first time matching a print, don't worry about it. Just pick where you'd like the print to line up on one of the sides of your pattern piece, and it'll start to make sense after we cut it out. Then we're going to cut this out. We're just going to cut out one though. It doesn't matter if it's the left or the right that you've placed first. We're going to just cut out one. Cut that first pattern piece out and transfer any markings like darts and pleats. And we have one side cut out. Now on your pattern piece, we're going to fold in the seam allowance on the line you marked on the pattern piece earlier, and on the fabric piece that you just cut out, we're going to press in the seam allowance. This is a really important step, so make sure to do this carefully. I can always tell if I've been a little sloppy here, as things don't line up as well in the end. So we have our first piece with our seam allowance folded in, and our pattern piece with the seam allowance also folded in, and we're going to cut out our second piece. Now here's the trick that makes this all work. We're going to take our first cut out pattern piece with our seam allowance folded under still, and we're going to move it around on our remaining piece of fabric until we get the print to match up exactly at this folded under seam line, in my case, center back seam line. So I'm going to just move this around until from the top to the bottom, I have a 100% match to my fabric. And sometimes you might need to scoot this around a little bit. You know, maybe the grain is slightly off or something. But if we get this lined up exactly, and if you've been careful in what you've pressed and folded under on the fabric and what you folded under on your paper pattern piece, then we will have a perfectly matching seam here. So once you do this, it's almost like an optical illusion. You can barely even see this fabric piece. So now we're going to take our paper pattern piece and we're going to, it'll be flipped to the opposite side we cut out before. So in my case earlier, I cut it out for the right side. Now I'm cutting it out for the left side. And with that seam allowance folded under, all I'm going to do here is line it up exactly with the piece that I've already cut out. So it's going to be folded edge to folded edge, exactly from the top to the bottom, the raw edges. And to keep this in place, you'll probably want to weigh this down, but don't weigh down the folded part because we're going to unfold that in a minute. And what we're going to do here is once we have this laid perfectly against this, I'm going to move my fabric piece out of the way and I'm done with that. I'm going to unfold my seam allowance here. And now when I cut this out, I will have matched the print perfectly from this side to this side. So I'm going to cut this out next. Going back one step, just to caution you, don't under any circumstances forget to unfold the seam allowance or you'll accidentally cut off that seam allowance. So make sure that you fold out that folded edge before you start cutting. Now you have a left and a right pattern piece that will match perfectly along that straight seam line, in my case the center back seam line of a bodice. All you need to do before you sew that seam is just give the first piece that you cut out a light press to remove that fold line. Pin the seam carefully because the goal here is to make sure what you spent all that time to line up will stay lined up when you sew it. Although sometimes you'll still find that you might need to unpick a little bit to resew the seam to get it perfect. I highly recommend using a walking foot when you sew this seam to help the fabric from shifting. You can watch my walking foot tips video for more. I'll link it in the description. Taking more time is never a bad idea here, and occasionally you might find part of the seam doesn't match up as well as you thought. If so, just unpick that part and use the edge you folded in earlier as a guide to line it up more precisely. Even though you pressed the fold back open, there is always still a hint of it left, so it can really help if that happens to you. With just a little bit of patience, you'll have an almost perfectly lined up print along your seam line every time with this easy method. Yay! And it doesn't matter if you're going to just sew the seam like here, or if you're going to do a zipper of some kind. I have a dress here where I did a lapped zipper in the center back seam, and the pattern is matched across that zipper. Because the trick is basically all in the cutting out stage, your seam line will always match either way. So here's a quick recap for how to perfectly match a print along a straight seam. Draw the seam line on the pattern piece showing your seam allowance. On a single layer of fabric, figure out where you want to place the pattern piece on your fabric for the first piece. Once you're happy with the placement, cut the piece out. On your pattern piece, fold in the seam allowance on the line that you marked on the pattern piece earlier. And on your fabric piece that you just cut out, press in the same seam allowance. Now lay the cut out piece of fabric with the seam allowance folded under still, face up on the fabric until it matches up to another part of the fabric exactly. Take your paper pattern piece and again with the seam allowance folded in still, line up the paper piece to the fabric piece exactly. Pull the fabric piece away and unfold the seam allowance on the paper piece so it's laying fully flat again. Now you just have to cut out the second fabric piece and go ahead and sew that seam carefully or insert your zipper. Just follow your favorite zipper installation method since you already did the work to make the print match. Now go off and have fun matching your prints across your center back and center front seams and zippers. It's one of my favorite things to do that adds an impressive touch, but now you can see it's deceptively easy to do. For more sewing tutorials, check out one of these two videos, and I'll see you soon with more sewing tips and projects. For a center front or center back front. Center front, center back, center front, back. Yeah, okay.